Do your models have pudding bases? Are they terribly wobbly and fall over all the time? Do you have models that are so small they need some extra support? Or does the model's base not fit the game that you're playing? Well, I have an answer, because what you need is this. Well, not this exact one, obviously. This is well used. But today I'm going to show you how to make a base mold for normal size bases that fit pudding bases inside them. Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and I've been working on this technique for a little while. But first, let me just explain what a pudding base is so that we're all on the same page. For those who don't know, a pudding base is a small piece of material that is moulded as part of the feet and legs of a model. Usually this is just enough to support the model so that it stands up by itself. However, they're also often very small, usually long and thin because of the limitations of moulding, although some companies do get around that. It is generally very common for people who want to use a different type base to actually just glue the pudding base directly to the top of a normal gaming base, and that's absolutely fine, and that works really well. However, you do have to take into account the step in between the pudding base and the surface of the main base. If you're doing various types of texture paint, that usually isn't a problem. And even then, a little bit of milliput up the edge to make a little mound and some rocks scattered around, it's all very easy to deal with. The much more difficult idea that I have seen some people do is to actually try to remove the pudding base, which with a plastic model can be relatively easy, or it can be a little fiddly, but with metal models, yeah, just try getting a blade between there and cutting that away. Very difficult and very good chance of you damaging the model. But I've recently been doing a lot of silicone moulding and resin casting, and I realised if you were to make a mould of a base where the top surface of the base is pointed upwards when it's moulded, then you can put that pudding base inside the resin before it's cured, and when it cures, the pudding base will be inside and fused inside and glued inside and permanently fixed into the resin. Now for the video today, I do want to go through the process of making this type of mold, but I've already got this type of mold and I don't particularly care for having another. This has 5 slots, no, 2 got damaged, but this has 5 slots, and so I can do 5 at a time. And I've pretty much gone through most of the models I have, sorting them out into the normal bases. However, I do have some very small models. And these on a 25mm base would look a little weird, so what I want to do here is make a slightly smaller base. I want to make a 20mm base in the same style, make a mold of that, and then I can do resin pours with these little tiny creatures inside, and they can be on a 20mm base. So I'll pass over to a post-recorded message of myself, and let's get to that.
Well, yes, thanks past me. So the first thing I need is an original version of the part that I want to make a mould of. In this case, I want a 20mm round base with a void underneath. For my 25mm mould, I simply grabbed a few of the 25mm bases I already had, so that was no trouble at all. But I don't have any 20mm bases, so I have to make my own. In this case, I've spent all of not very long designing and 3D printing a few 20mm bases to my own personal specifications, and just gave them quick sand around the edge to make sure that they're nice and smooth. Silicone can grab rough surfaces, and every moulding will be a copy of the original, so every moulding could damage that further and further. More importantly, I wanted every base from this mould to be nice and smooth, so if I smooth the original version, then the copies will also be smooth. With those cleaned and thoroughly dried, I needed a container for my mould, a mould for the mould, if you will. Thankfully, I keep hold of such suitable things, and this blister pack is just perfect. Watertight, fairly shallow, and just wide enough for 3 of my bases, well, actually quite a bit wider than that, but I only printed 3 of them, that's plenty. The important thing at this step is to secure my origin version bases to the bottom of the mould, and to do that upside down. Some materials might float in silicone before the silicone fully cures, which will ruin your mould, and when it's cured we want to turn it the other way up, and so the bases need to be upside down at this stage. There's plenty of videos out there on different silicons and how to best use them and which ones you want to buy. I am no expert, but I can at least pass on some useful basic tips. Which silicon to buy? One that says it's for mold making. Check eBay or your local DIY or craft shops. How to use it? Well, that one's easy. Read the instructions. No, really. Many silicons are different and you need to use each one as they are intended, otherwise they might not cure properly. In my case, I have a ratio of 10:1, so I put 10 parts of the white silicon and 1 part of the orange hardener. Mix it well, mix till your arms fall off. I really appreciate the orange dye that's in the hardener because you can clearly see when it's fully mixed, but still, give it a little extra mixing just to be completely sure. Now to pour the silicon, and I'm here pouring from quite high up to make this a thin stream, as the thin stream cannot support large bubbles created when mixing. Notice that I'm also pouring in the same spot and letting the silicon flow for itself, rather than running rings around each of the original bases. This is so that there's the minimum opportunity for it to capture air bubbles. It's all about reducing air bubbles. And I also tap the moulding once it's poured to get any bubbles there to come to the surface. Now I just wait for the intended time of the silicon. In this case it's 12 hours. You can easily get 24 or 48 hour silicon, which gives the silicon longer to clear out those bubbles. After that, carefully pull out the hardened silicon mould and we are ready to use it. Having a close look at what we have here, essentially a block of silicon with a void on top, and once we pour the resin in, it will conform to that shape, and as the top surface is open, we can put stuff into that and have it poke out of the top. And you may find that some silicon has leaked in between the base and your mould, but by putting one of the original version bases back into the mould, you can very carefully trace it around with a very sharp knife and cut that away cleanly. So, let's have a go. I have found, by making quite a few mistakes, that it is always a good idea to check how your model will go into the mould before you start mixing the resin. Make sure it balances, as if it falls into the resin you're going to have a really bad time cleaning that up, but also you want to know how much resin to put in. You want enough resin so that it fully contacts the bottom of the pudding base and comes just up the sides a little bit, but not so much that it overflows the pudding base and starts pulling up your model's legs. Using a cheap pipette to move resin around can be helpful to add or remove tiny amounts of resin to ensure that it's just perfect. As before, there's many videos on resins and I'll cover just some of the basics. Follow the instructions to get the ratio correct, mix it well, mix it really well, and you can pour it from one container to another to remove some of the bubbles before using the pipette to move it into the mould. Try not to move them around once they're in the resin, as you risk knocking over a model or creating tears in the resin if it's partially cured. I generally prefer a lower viscosity resin and a long cure time, in this case 48 hours, as that often gives the best opportunity for the bubbles to clear. It's also the case that mixing very small batches of resin can be difficult, so having a few projects on the go can make up that difference. But after my 48 hours of curing time, let's have a closer look. Now that the resin has fully cured, we can demold the bases. I prefer to gently pull around the edge and then press up from underneath to free the silicone cleanly, as that will make the mould last a little bit longer. You may notice that the top edge of the resin has pulled upwards a little. This is due to the surface tension of the resin when it's a liquid, and as it hardens it keeps that shape. There are several ways to alleviate this, such as filling the bowl with texture paste, or a second very small resin pour to level it off. However, I usually cut at least the very edge of it away, as it's sometimes quite messy. Be careful when doing this and use the safe death grip with the knife so that you don't cut yourself, and maybe get a parent's help if you're younger, let them cut their fingers for you. You may have noticed a couple of these models are already painted, and that's one thing that you don't have to worry about with most rebasing styles, but certainly not this one. You'll want to prime your new base and without hitting any of your lovely painted model. To do this, I usually wrap a piece of kitchen paper around the model and then just spray it with a rattle can. You can also use an airbrush primer, or, in the case of this one, using an airbrush primer as a brush-on primer. That works as well. And then you can get to painting your model and the base in whatever way you wish. For the video, I picked out a Bad Squiddo Games rabbit and one of the Pegasi, guinea pig Pegasus, and also a 3D printed cat. But I'll just paint the rabbit for the video, as this is already running on quite long. And I did that with a blue-grey base coat and picking out some of the fur with white, which honestly wasn't very neat at all, and a black wash to bring out all of the sculpted fur, which is actually very nice on these models. Dotting the eyes with red and the nose and ears with pink was just as difficult, but the important step for this video is to finish up that base, which of course I forgot to film, but it was really just some crackle paste over the black primer. It goes on as a liquid, and then as it dries it shrinks and breaks apart to form this dry, dusty desert look. For my elf, which is a WizKids model I painted some years ago, before I primed it I'd glued down some small stones and baking powder, and then after priming I painted dark brown and dry brushed with black and light brown mix to create a damp, swampy desert look. I also did the cat with some Games Workshop texture paste, and it looks terrible, and so I'll have to scrape all of that off and try again, but I'll do that some other time. And the Pegasi will be painted by its rightful owner, Amethyst Quill. Thank you very much for letting me borrow the models for the video. And so there you have it, my technique for rebasing models that have pudding bases. I have to admit that it is quite an involved process, and whilst not really difficult at any step, it does take quite a lot of time. I would say for most people, most of the time, simply gluing the pudding base to a normal base and then using texture paste or some Milliput maybe to bridge the gap is probably the better option. However, for those who like experimenting with different ways of doing things, this might just be an interesting one to look at. Please comment below if you found any of this interesting, and share it with one of your crafty friends who might try something like this. Also check the description and all of the other YouTubey stuff. I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.